if the government doesn't get its act together and control this spending, it'll have real consequences for taxpayers in terms of tax hikes. And it's even worse because we're at a time right now where people are having trouble affording the basics. And the last thing they need is Ottawa coming into their pocket and taking more of their money from them. But if they keep spending this way, it's something that it will have to do.
We're the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, where we are fighting for lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. I'm Chris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm here for a special budget video with my friend, Gage Halbrick. Gage, of course, is the Prairie Director. He's holding down the fort in Saskatchewan, and he also covers stuff for Manitoba. Now, Gage, you and I were nerding out over the budget. Okay, so Franco was in lockup and he was busy doing a whole bunch of media in Mordor there, also known as Ottawa. And then you and I were trying to go through this behemoth. I don't know what page count it was for you. On my side, it was 498 pages. We were trying to find details about the industrial carbon tax. I found some words in there, but it was really hard for me to find some numbers in there. What were you seeing?
Yeah, pretty much the same. Franco is a smart guy, but I think
Mhm.
even him's going to have trouble going through almost 500 pages of government politic-speak, and I don't think it's good for his mental health to do it all on his own elsewise. But unfortunately, after going through the full thing, Carney still isn't telling Canadians how much his hidden carbon tax on businesses is going to cost. All he really says in there is that he's going to strengthen the industrial carbon tax, words he's used before, as well as, this is going to be a little bit weird words again, setting a multi-decade industrial carbon price trajectory that targets net zero by 2050. So that sounds like nonsense, and it largely is. But I think taxpayers can rightly look at it and see that that means make more expensive over time. Because,
Yeah.
Chris, as you know, that's how the old carbon tax worked. Every single year, the government would hike the price higher, and then you pay more at the gas pumps. So the government's looking probably to do the same thing here, but on the carbon tax they're charging businesses.
Yeah, to me, just reading this budget, it was more of it's almost like I was trying to interpret fiction than actually read math and charts in this one. And this fiction could have been written by Bram Stoker because there's a monster climbing its way out of the grave. Here, we've got a zombie carbon tax coming back, and it's going to be in the form of an industrial carbon tax, and it's going to be real hard for us to see.
But
Now, go ahead, give her.
any fiction writer will tell you though that clarity is key on
Yes.
making a good story, but this budget was not clear in whatsoever. Even at one point here, it says that his carbon tax will have negligible impacts on affordability for Canadians. He doesn't say how much it will cost or how much it'll cost businesses, Canadians, anyone. It just says negligible impacts. I mean, I don't really buy that. Did you buy that when you read that part?
Not for a hot second. In fact, let's hear it directly from Dr. Frankenstein, okay? Because he's the one that's busy sewing this monster together, okay, under the dark of night, okay? And let's hear what Prime Minister Mark Carney actually has to say about his industrial carbon tax monster.
Mr. Speaker, in the spring, this government removed the divisive consumer carbon tax, and that has a consequence. That has a consequence for any business, any farm that emits less than 50 kilotons, which is every farm across this country. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Climate Institute has done the analysis, and the impact of the industrial carbon tax on inflation is zero.
Okay, so this shouldn't surprise anybody. A politician is telling us that a tax isn't going to cost us anything. Um, Gage, I don't think people are going to buy it this time because the carbon tax, the original one, the OG carbon tax, consumer carbon tax, it sure cost us an arm and a leg.
No, exactly. And I know you have the numbers that we can get into about how much
Yeah.
exactly the carbon tax was taking, but it's common sense, right? It doesn't even make sense on any point of view. From the government's point of view, if they do want people to change their behavior and use less carbon, it has to cost them something, right? So there has to be a cost there even for it to work from the government's point of view. But from a regular taxpayer, it simply doesn't pass the sniff test either, right? Because if you're putting a carbon tax on businesses, that's going to increase costs for those businesses, and those costs are going to be pushed to regular, everyday Canadians, right? If you put a carbon tax on a fuel refinery, that makes gas more expensive. You put a carbon tax on utilities that make home heating or electricity, that makes that more expensive for people on their bills. And when you put a carbon tax on a fertilizer plant, right, making it so we can grow all the wonderful things we do, like here in Saskatchewan, that's going to make food more expensive when farmers have to pay more for those fertilizers. And then there's the third point that's also important that the government isn't talking about, right? Our next door neighbor, the United States, who, we're not on greatest terms with right now, doesn't have a national carbon tax, right? So if you're a company and you're a fertilizer plant in Brandon, Manitoba, and the government comes up to you and says, hey, we're going to hit you with this big industrial carbon tax, that fertilizer factory can just say, hey, I'm actually going to move to North Dakota where I don't have to pay this carbon tax, and it's going to take all their jobs with them, and that hurts Canadians too.
Yeah, big time. For folks in Ontario that are like, oh, well, I don't remember the last time I drove past a fertilizer plant. A, you got lots of them there. You just don't realize it. But B, if you're looking at your steel industry, okay, or your aluminum, right, all that stuff, you're looking at your metal manufacturing and all your industry, look no further than the last federal election. Remember, we saw the phenomenon that I can't recall ever seeing before, Gage, at least in Canada, where we had a labor union, okay, the pipe workers out of Hamilton, who were sounding the alarm bell about Carney's industrial carbon tax so loud, so hard, they were saying this would, quote, decimate their industry, their words. And they felt so strongly about it, they endorsed the blue team. Like, I can't remember the last time a labor union directly endorsed the blue team. Now, it didn't work out for Pierre Poilievre, but I think that the data and the stats, they are bearing fruit. They're right there. Because, look at it this way, to your point, if you're an industry and you're manufacturing stuff and you have a choice, you can either manufacture that stuff in Canada with a huge industrial carbon tax that is costing you megabucks every year, or you can just pop across the US border where there is no national carbon tax and it's costing you less. I will point this out too. It's not like the United States barely doesn't have an industrial carbon tax or that they were on the brink of having a national carbon tax. No, Barack Obama said no to having a national carbon tax. Hillary Clinton never ever ran on having, let's have a national carbon tax. So this is not even in the cards in the States. And yet we're just galloping down this road here in Canada. I wanted to get your thoughts on this too. Did you notice some of the language? Again, that's why I'm calling this thing. It's like a Frankenstein's monster or a zombie or something, but it is monstrous, gross, and scary. This industrial carbon tax, the language in the budget sounded so similar to the original carbon tax. Did you catch the whole backstops and benchmarks?
Well, that's where I wanted to get to next. I think it's an important point for taxpayers and for me and people in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So the government mentions on there that they're going to change how they apply the backstop and essentially make it more stringent. And what the backstop means is that if your provincial government has decided that they're not going to screw you with a carbon tax, the federal government is going to step in and screw you from Ottawa instead. I mean, that's something that Westerners are awful familiar with, getting screwed by Ottawa. So I don't think anyone's having trouble understanding that one. But there becomes the problem for Saskatchewanians and Albertans, right? So back before the consumer carbon tax was gone, even Scott Moe completely canceled the provincial industrial carbon tax in Saskatchewan, helping industries, helping families, making life more affordable. Danielle Smith in Alberta went not quite as far, but just freezed the latest hike on the industrial carbon tax. But based on the language of this budget, to me, I don't know about you, Chris, but it looks like the government's going to try and step in and reimpose carbon taxes on these provinces, despite the fact that the governments and the people there obviously don't want them.
Yep, it's going to happen in a heartbeat. So the benchmark, okay, that's what we were calling here at the Taxpayers Federation. That's the mandatory minimum. Okay. So people are used to this in kind of sentencing, right? Back before with the justice system in previous governments, and we had mandatory minimums. So this is a mandatory minimum industrial carbon tax. In government jargon, they call it a backstop. So meaning a province can have its own industrial carbon tax, but the rate, the cost to taxpayers has to be higher or at the same rate as what the federal government would otherwise impose. Okay. Then what's going to happen is they're now going to wind up in a fight with the provinces again. And I got to point this out here in Alberta. It is absurd that we have an industrial carbon tax. It just straight up is. Now, I know the argument, okay? I can hear it coming from Edmonton, from the legislature. Well, we need one because our oil and gas industry executive muckety-mucks say that we need one. And, it's all part of their closed system and it doesn't actually cost money. And it's all them trading carbon credits with each other for some reason. None of that matters. Politically, all you're doing by refusing to get rid of your provincial industrial carbon tax is giving permission for one. That's all you're doing. You cannot appease an alligator or a crocodile hoping it's going to eat you last. Okay? We should have learned this ages ago. Okay? Alberta should not have any carbon taxes. And thank you, next door, you rectangle people in Saskatchewan. You're really putting pressure on Alberta because Scott Moe is showing up Alberta here by him saying we're a carbon tax-free zone. And then you look next door to Alberta, and for some reason, we have this inexplicable, no cost to us, totally closed carbon tax. Like, that doesn't make any sense. They should get rid of it completely. So that way, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, they can just link arms and fight Ottawa. And frankly, they're the happiest when they're doing that. I don't understand why they're holding back on this. Did we want to get into the cost of the original carbon tax? Because I think it's a really good example for people to remember.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a good point. You should get into that because as we talked about, we looked through this whole budget. We looked at all the gobbledygook sentences the government had constructed over the past time, and not at any point that I saw or you saw was there a dollar figure for what this industrial carbon tax is going to cost the average family. But we do know what the old consumer carbon tax was costing people.
Yeah, and it's brutal. So a few things. One, if people want to read the budget, they should do so with the eyes of George Orwell, because the language, the government jargon being used in here, it's almost funny because you have to laugh or cry. So I'm choosing to laugh. The language they're using, Gage, with the old consumer carbon tax, you'd think that this government hated that old carbon tax and they're getting rid of it and it's so stinky and it's nothing to do with it. This is the same government.
But they still wouldn't admit that it was expensive, right? They only said that they were canceling the divisive carbon tax. I don't know about you. We talk about a lot of issues here, but
Yeah.
usually when something's divisive, it's because it's hurting someone or someone has some reason to disagree with it. It's not just divisive because it exists. It was divisive because it was costing people money. That's what they're actually saying, but they're refusing to say that even in the budget still.
It's my favorite. And so what I did is just morbid curiosity. I went back to the original budgets. Okay. Remember when former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in charge and he invented the carbon tax and the budget was supposed to balance itself and all that jazz? Okay. So in order to find this, I kid you not, I have to read it directly from my quote here because our op-ed's coming out pretty soon in the newspaper you and I wrote together, Gage. In order to find it, in a normal budget, like in British Columbia's budget, for example, you can just find the cost of the carbon tax as a line item under revenue. Okay? Government revenue is what it takes in taxes and fees. So in the BC budget, it's just listed as carbon tax revenue, okay, or whatever they call it, carbon price revenue, something like that. No, no, no. So this is what the government called the revenue from the carbon tax. Quote, pollution pricing proceeds to be returned to Canadians. I kid you not. That's what they named the carbon tax. So even finding this thing is hard because you can't just control F, look for carbon, right? No, they don't even use the word carbon. Pollution pricing proceeds to be returned to Canadians. Then I added them all up. I hope folks are sitting down. It is more than $45 billion. $45 billion taken from Canadians in the consumer carbon tax. And that is just the line item in the budget. That's not adding up all the extra costs associated with having a carbon tax like that, like the ones that the PBO worked out and all those calculations. This is just straight cash out of your wallet into their coffers. $45 billion.
And it's ridiculous. We look at the government, and even Carney was saying, I want to spend less, invest more, help Canadians in some way, but is refusing to admit that $45 billion went out of the pockets of Canadians and cost them money. It's easy to recognize that getting rid of the consumer carbon tax obviously makes life more affordable for people. It should be just as easy to recognize that this other hidden carbon tax does the same thing. Because I know we've gone on about it, but it's true. A carbon tax, a tax for that matter, no matter its name, makes things more expensive. Because in order for it to be a tax, the government has to take money from you. And that's what it's doing in all of these scenarios.
Yes, and I think that's what our main message is here. A, to warn people about the industrial carbon tax. It's real, it's already here, but it's going to be bigger, stronger, and worse. Catch is we don't know exactly how much yet, but we're going to figure that out. Two, I would strongly encourage, so when people are watching mainstream media and stuff, they've done a reasonable job here, but when they're listening to spin happen about this budget, people need to put their translators in, okay, into their ears here, like Star Trek. And they need to realize that when Carney is saying buzzwords like catalytic or catalyze, I can't even remember what dumb word he was using, but he was using the word invest, 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 spend, spend, spend. That's what he's saying there, okay? And I don't know if you want to geek out with me in econ, but I do want to pick your brain on this. Are you concerned that at the end of the day, that international credit rating agencies are going to look at this fiscal document? I won't call this a budget because it's disgusting. It's $78 billion, okay, that they're overspending. Are you concerned that international credit rating agencies are going to be taking a hard look at Canada now? Because they see through this, right? They don't care what kind of spangly label Carney's putting on his spending bucket, do they?
Oh, definitely. And I think we've already seen a little bit of that from Fitch, one of those big credit rating agencies down in the States that have said the government's basically spending too much, and that's a problem. And it's hard to kind of think about it when you're a regular person, right? Because billions of dollars are insane amounts of money. But what these credit rating agencies actually care about is the ability for the government to repay its debt, right? So
Yep.
as the government keeps going into debt more, keeps spending more and more money on debt interest payments, that means there's less other money going around. So there's a higher chance that the government could have trouble paying its debt. And that has a couple of consequences, right? The one we always talk about, the more money spent on debt interest payments, the less money can be spent on things that might actually be useful or provide tax relief. But second, once the government gets into that really deep fiscal hole, it gets more difficult to climb out. I'll give an example in Saskatchewan. In the late 90s, the Saskatchewan government had ballooned the debt to crazy levels where, in all but name, the government of Saskatchewan had essentially gone bankrupt. So it couldn't get any more loans. So the government can't borrow any more money to pay for stuff. Where does it then have to go? To taxpayers. It goes into taxpayer wallets through tax hikes. So three different taxes were hiked in the 90s in Saskatchewan because the government had to pay back its huge debt problem. And that's why this debt just isn't a nice thing for an accountant to want to see paid down. If the government doesn't get its act together and control this spending, it'll have real consequences for taxpayers in terms of tax hikes. And it's even worse because we're at a time right now where people are having trouble affording the basics. And the last thing they need is Ottawa coming into their pocket and taking more of their money from them. But if they keep spending this way, it's something that it will have to do.
I'm concerned going forward because I will admit, maybe I had the last bit of being naive here. I was hoping that Carney would be better than Trudeau with money. So, like all politics aside, straight up, the guy's got a PhD from Oxford in economics, okay? He was the head of the Bank of Canada. He was the head of the Bank of England. So, I'm old enough to remember when Paul Martin was finance minister And we had some adults in the room, okay? People like John Manley, people like Dan McTagg, some serious people who were in the room. And that was a liberal government. That was a red jersey government. But they took the deficit seriously. I remember Paul Martin looking, it was at the Vancouver Board of Trade, and they had their version of a debt clock kind of baked into the wall. And he looked at it and he said, I keep getting distracted by that damn clock. Like, I can't get it out of my head. Going forward, I guess I'm just asking you philosophically, are we going to be able to bring enough adults into this room? Will Carney listen if we have some adults coming into this room saying, listen, man, like money is not a social construct. Like this is serious dollars and cents. If we don't get our act together, we're going to get a credit downgrade. Do you see room for that happening?
Oh, definitely. In
Okay.
multiple senses, I think the government's going to have to act on this sooner rather than later. Like you said, Carney is not a dumb person, right?
No,
Like he knows what's going on. He'll eventually have to figure out that this is something we have to do. So I think that that's probably step one. Also, to be a little bit optimistic, maybe naive. Don't shoot me in the comments. But
it's okay. I was already shot earlier about it. It's fine.
but second, I think that as we go forward on this, we have taxpayers across the country who care about these things,
Yes.
right? So as long as we keep up the pressure on the politicians by emailing them, telling our local MPs that this is a problem and needs to be dealt with, it pushes them in the right direction to actually do something about it. To go back to the carbon tax, that's exactly how Canadian taxpayers got the consumer carbon tax gone, right?
Great.
It was a long fight, but it was a fight that we won in the end. So all we have to do is keep up that pressure, keep fighting against the government to stop wasting so much money and actually get the debt going down. But I think it's definitely possible and definitely doable.
I keep these two books on my desk because I picture them fighting a lot. So this, of course, is Mark Carney's book that he wrote before he became prime minister. It's called Values. I recommend, Gage has already read it. I think you've read it 3 times, and I'm sorry, but I'm glad you did because it's carbon taxes, his little obsession with global carbon taxes and carbon tax tariffs, all that stuff is all in here. Okay. He wrote this while he was the UN special envoy on blah, blah, blah. Okay. It's endorsed by Bono, that Irish musician person. And he quotes Greta Thunberg all through it. So, frankly, his plan for a big industrial carbon tax that's baked into the budget here doesn't surprise me, but we still need the numbers from it. And this book, a much better book, is written by none other than Franco Terrazzano, our federal director of the Taxpayers Federation, who gives a bit of a history on when this thing started, carbon taxes in Canada, and most importantly, to your point exactly, Gage, how tax fighters beat it
Hmm.
because
Yep.
it was just a few years ago when what's his face had taken over the leader of as the Conservative Party and he betrayed tax fighters and said, "Oh, actually, we want a blue team carbon tax." I don't think so. Okay. People wrote in droves and he was no longer leader. Okay. So tax fighters pushed back on the carbon tax and now this carbon tax is truly gone. So that's great. To your point, Gage, and I think a bit of a pep talk for ourselves and for our viewers is that it's possible to change minds in politics. And to your point, I'll put it this way. We just had an election, okay? Some of these MPs are new, and some of these cabinet ministers are currently getting chewed on by these new MPs, okay? It's our responsibility as constituents to contact our local MPs and get in their heads and say, scrap this industrial carbon tax and quit wasting all this money. You got to balance the budget. I think if we just keep that up relentlessly of no more carbon taxes and fight the debt, I think that we can turn the ship around.
No, I think that's definitely right. And as always, when it comes to fighting with the Taxpayers Federation as a tax fighter, the first step is signing a petition. So, with Carney talking about this new industrial carbon tax, well, different industrial carbon taxes still existed before, to be clear. If you care about this and you want to fight it in the same way that you fought the consumer carbon tax, head on over to our website, taxpayer.com, and sign the petition to stop all carbon taxes, to stop hidden carbon taxes, and then we'll let you know when it's time to take action and continue that fight against Ottawa.
Perfect. That is how we're going to beat this, guys. I want everybody to have their chin up, okay? Because ultimately, members of parliament, they answer to you. They do. And fundamentally, what they care about is getting reelected. So if you say, I will door knock against you if you do not fix this. They will pay attention because then it's their paycheck that's actually on the line and not yours. So head on over to our website, taxpayer.com, sign the petition to fight the debt and to get rid of all carbon taxes in Canada, because this is how we win. And very importantly, for this show, make sure if you're watching us on YouTube, like this video. I know it sounds funny, okay, but it really helps the algorithm and like the magic in the box. Also, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think about this kind of coverage. Let us know what you think about the budget and Carney's hidden industrial carbon tax. And most importantly, share this video with people who need to know.